Everybody wonders, why does the flu come when it comes? And what's the weather got to do with it? What's your answer?
My answer is that it seems to be linked with humidity. There have been, the observation that you get the flu in temperate regions, areas like where we live in the wintertime, has been something that people have noticed for thousands of years. And there have been three basic competing ideas as to why that's happened. One has to do with the fact that people spend more time indoors in the wintertime. They get clustered indoors, and that facilitates the contact among people. Another has to do with changes in how your immune system functions. So in the wintertime, people have less exposure to sunlight, there's less melatonin, less vitamin D production. It may diminish your immune function, and as a consequence, you may be more susceptible to the flu. But the third has to do with environmental factors. And people have long looked at things like temperature and humidity to see if there's a connection. And we found that there's a particular type of humidity, absolute humidity, that seems to be very strongly linked to the survival and the transmission of the flu, and is very consistent with the timing of outbreaks of flu in certain areas.
Now, when you talk about humidity, you're talking about the amount of water in the air, but not necessarily the way, like it's not so humid in Arizona, but there can be a flu outbreak in Arizona.
Right, because it really has to do with the big changes that take place from summer to winter. So even in a place like Arizona, you can have really high humidity in the summertime, and you have less humidity in the wintertime. Even though it's still warm, even though it's still more humid than it may be in New York City or maybe in Chicago in the wintertime, there's a big change in the amount of humidity and amount of water vapor that's in the air. And as a result of that, it seems to really favor the transmission during the wintertime in these places.
Now, the big question, of course, is does climate change have a potential impact on influenza transmission?
It's really hard to gauge. One of the things that we do know is as the planet warms, certainly temperatures are obviously going to increase. But one of the things that's going to go along with that is we would expect to see an increase in the absolute humidity content of the air, the amount of water vapor in the air. It's tied with the temperature in certain ways due to certain physics of the system. And if that's the case, you would think that you might see a diminution of the amount of flu that's taking place, the amount of flu that there is. But unfortunately, the dynamics of the whole system are more complicated. It's not just a simple one-to-one response. And what we might have is we might have some changes, but how it's actually going to play out is something that's very difficult to ascertain. It's an uncertainty.
Right now, though, with what you know so far, is it possible for you to look at this year's or next year's influenza season and say, well, we've got these kind of weather conditions, here's where the outbreak's going to occur?
It's one of the things that we're trying to do. So we're trying to develop forecast models of influenza that are very similar and built in the same mechanics as we have in numerical weather prediction. You take a core model, you take real-time observations, and you use some statistical techniques to bring the two together. And what it does is it optimizes the model and it gets it to behave a lot better than it would if it were left to own its own devices. And what we found is that we're able to generate some skillful forecasts of what's going on. Certainly we tried it in New York City, and that was our pilot area, and that's what we've been able to see. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to scale that up and see if we can make this operational so that we can start issuing weekly forecasts of what's going to happen with the flu that have some forecast skill. I think this is something that we could see coming online in the next few years. It's something that's still very much in a test phase, but we're very encouraged by what we see so far. The question then is, well, how much utility is it going to have, and how are we going to use the information? Certainly, we hear about things like pollen counts on the local weather reports and pollution, so things related to health are given out. It's possible we could be giving this out to the public as well, and they develop some sort of comfort level to know that, when they hear there's an increased risk of flu, you're not going to just yank your kids out of school.